بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to another course, and inshallah in this course we will continue and conclude our discussion of marriage and divorce. And this is a large topic in one's life, and it's also a large topic accordingly in the Sharia, in which there are a lot of rules related to that. So today's class, inshallah, we're going to pick up right where we left off, which is to begin the discussion of the number of divorces. And this is a topic where I want to say at the outset, I don't want to say there's a big difference, but there is a difference between what we're going to study, the theory of the law, and how the law is applied. In this course, we are going to be consumed largely, like 90% of the time, with the theory. I want you to also keep in mind that everything that we're going to say, there's going to be a but. How it is dealt with in a real life situation, that's something different. So when we apply the fiqh in a fatwa point of view, real life point of view, there are going to be things that we're we're going to be a little bit biased to try to keep the marriage together, to try to keep the count, rather than be 3, let it be 2, rather than 2 divorces, let it be 1, so on and so forth. We're not really going to talk about that because this is not the place to do that. This has to be done in another setting. But I want that to be clear, so in the back of your mind, you have that knowledge. Okay, we're going to pick up and talk about the number of divorces. Of course, we know that the man is able to divorce his wife 3 times, and then we are going to talk about what that means, and then we are going to talk about when you make an exception, right? So the exception, you are divorced 3 except 2. You are divorced 3 except 3. What does that mean? You are divorced 2 except 1, etc. And then we are going to talk about a divorce pronouncement that is contingent on an attribute or a condition. So if you do this, you are divorced. When the sun comes up, you are divorced. Those are 2 different types of structures. We're going to talk about them, and maybe we'll kind of get into some examples. A lot of the examples are going to be ridiculous, as is the case with, I don't mean it in a pejorative way. They'll be far-fetched, let's say, because to keep the idea fresh in our minds. And then we will conclude with the line, pronouncing divorce prior to marriage does not take effect. And what does that mean? Those are the main topics. We'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so we begin our fiqh discussion in class the way we always begin, which is to turn directly to the Arabic text. I will read the Arabic text as is our habit, do a quick translation, and then let's pop into the adillah and see if there's anything worth mentioning. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في طلاق الحر والعبد وما يملكانه من الطلقات. ويملك الحر ثلاث تطليقات والعبد تطليقتين. ويصح الاستثناء في الطلاق إذا وصله به، ويصح تعليقه بالصفة والشرط، ولا يقع الطلاق قبل النكاح. Okay, so what does that mean? He says, rahimahullah, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on Qadi Abi Shuja' radiallahu anhu. May we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. The number of divorces. A free man possesses 3 divorces, a slave possesses 2. It is valid to make an exception when pronouncing a divorce, provided it is connected to the pronouncement. It is also valid to make divorce contingent upon the occurrence of an attribute or condition. Pronouncing divorce prior to the marriage does not take effect. Okay. Let me pop in. Unfortunately, I did not look at this before I hit record, so I apologize, but let me just pop in really quickly. So, لا يقع طلاق قبل, no, I did that. Well, we have, of course, the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 229, الطلاق مرتان فإمساك بمعروف أو تصريح بإحسان. So you can divorce twice. After that, it's a final divorce. So that establishes the number of the divorce to be 3. فإن طلقها فلا تحل له من بعد حتى تنكح زوجا غيره. If the man divorces his wife 3 times, I mean, you have to read the verses in sequence to understand that the pronoun here is referring back to a 3 divorce, then they cannot remarry unless the woman marries another man, consummates the marriage, has a proper divorce, waits the waiting period, and then they can reset the marriage to the prior husband. We'll talk about that in its appropriate time, but that's verse 230. So verse 229 and verse 2230, verse 229 and verse 230 talk about the number of divorces being 3. We also have the hadith that's narrated in Dawood on the authority of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, who said, وَالْمُطَلِّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. Sorry, he is commenting on this verse, which is verse 228. So verse 228, 229, and 230 in Baqarah. So then Ibn Abbas says, قال وذلك أن الرجل كان إذا طلق امرأته فهو أحق برجعتها وإن طلقها ثلاثا فنسخ ذلك وقال الطلاق مرتان. So he says that a man has the right to divorce his wife twice, and after that, if he divorces her a third time, then that's severs the marriage. And then as far as the slave, and I know there's no slavery, but we still study the fiqh for the reasons I always mention, we have the hadith that's narrated in Dar al-Qutni that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam said, طلاق العبد طليقتان, that the slave can divorce twice. So the slave is always going to have less ownership, less rights, less, in this case, divorces, than the free person, because slavery is, a less of a state than a free person. With all of the, I can't keep repeating the caveats every time I hit record. And then as far as the exceptions, we have the hadith that's narrated in interesting, this is a hadith that's narrated by Ibn Athir in his Nihaya, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "Man a'taqa aw tallaqa wastathna falahu thunyahu." So whoever a man frees a slave or divorces a slave with an exception, so the exception counts. So the pronouncement, the divorce pronouncement is always going to, not always, but frequently will be twinned in the books of fiqh, and in this case the books of adillah, with the pronouncements of manumission. So you are free if, when the first of Rajab comes, right? So you'll find those kind of language in the books of manumission. So because it's a pronouncement, it's kind of the same theory of law governs the divorce pronouncement and the manumission pronouncement. If you free a slave and you have an exception, or if you free a slave with a condition, or so on and so forth, the same type of fiqh will apply. As far as the conditions are concerned, making a divorce pronouncement with conditions, he narrates the hadith of Hakim, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Al-Muslimuna 'inda shurutihim," that Muslims have to abide by their conditions. And then as far as the last line of the text for today's class, that there's no divorce prior to marriage, obviously you're not even married. This is the hadith that's narrated also in Hakim. This is a hadith that's narrated by Dawood on the authority of Amr ibn Shu'aib, on the authority of his father and on the authority of his grandfather, radiallahu anhum, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, لا نظر لابن آدم فيما لا يملك ولا عتق له فيما لا يملك ولا طلاق له فيما لا يملك. So you can't make an oath, you can't make a manumission, and you can't make a divorce in that which you do not own, meaning that's which you do not have position, in which case if you're not married, which means you don't have that woman under your auspices, then there is no divorce. Okay, so some of the adillah, I think in this case is pretty straightforward. Let me get the big guns out, which is the hashia, and let us begin, inshallah, our discussion of this topic. So, going back to the beginning here, we are talking now about the number of divorces, and then we want to talk about how these divorces can take place if there are some sort of conditions and whatnot. So the first thing he says is a free man possesses 3 divorces and a slave possesses 2. Now keep in mind, as I've mentioned, I believe I mentioned this to you all before, that the divorce is, the way I clunkily translate it, it's a male initiated severing of the marriage. So the reason I say that is to highlight the following point, which is that there are other ways that a marriage can be dissolved. So the khula is the woman-initiated divorce. I mean, it's not a divorce, it's called a khula, but I say that so to make people in the English language understand. The woman can initiate the severing of the marriage. It's called al-khula, and there's a different procedure to it. And then there's also the fasakh, there's also the annulment of the marriage that takes place from the judge. So when you study this, I want to caution you from any of the bias that might exist in the study of Islam by Orientalists or non-Muslims basically, that either don't understand the language, the Arabic language or the language of the Sharia, or the whole ethos. So here we are talking about at-talaq. When I say at-talaq, it's a male, the divorce means that it's initiated by the man. And that's why he begins by saying a free man can do that 3 times, and then the slave can do it twice for the reasons that I have mentioned. So if a man divorces his wife 3 times, in the Shafi'i madhab, that unfortunately can take place with one pronouncement. So a man can, in the Shafi'i madhab, can tell his wife, you are divorced 3 times. That counts as 3 divorces if it's a clear divorce. Now, in the beginning clip, in the introductory clip, I talked about theory and practice. In practice, we are not so draconian when it comes to the number of divorces, because there could be mitigating circumstances, and there are other legal opinions. So I don't want to flood you with all of that now because it's just going to make everything confusing for you. So let's just stick within the confines of the Shafi'i madhab so we can understand the theory, so that our minds become built according to the madhab. And then of course the slave has twice. Now, what happens if a free man divorces his wife twice and then becomes a slave? Because the second divorce of the free man is not a final divorce, he's still his wife. When he becomes a slave, he still has a divorce. But if a free man, this is just an interesting kind of like fiqh, trivia. If a free man divorces his wife once and then becomes a slave, then he'll only get one more divorce. So there is a, very, very unlikely, but it probably has happened in the past, in which people are unfortunately brought into captivity. So these types of fiqh discussions, take place so that the fuqaha can postulate what happens. But in general, the slave is going to have 2 divorces. Now, this is irrespective if the slave's wife is free or the slave's wife is a slave. And in the other case, if the free man's wife is a slave or the free man's wife is a free woman. It's the male who owns the 3 or the 2. We'll pause here and pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so we don't have to beat this more than already we have. The free man possesses 3 divorces and a slave possesses 2, and some of the things that we talked about. Now, when he talks about slave, I should also mention there are different types of slaves. We haven't talked about that yet. That will come at the end of the book. But there is like the muba'ad, the mukatab. There are different types of slaves that are partially free or partially owned. If a slave is partially free but partially a slave, he's still considered a slave. But he's on his way to manumission. So in the books of fiqh you'll find that. But again, it's not very applicable, so we don't need to spend too much time talking about that. Okay, ويصح الاستثناء. So it is valid to make an exception when pronouncing a divorce, provided it is connected to the pronouncement. So again, like fiqh, it's one sentence, but there's like a lot going on there. What's an exception? I divorce you 3 times except 2. Okay, so 3 minus 2 is 1, so you're divorced 1. Now, the exception can't do istighraq. It can't cover all of what you just said. So I can't say I divorce you 3 minus 3. If the negation or the exception covers the entire number of the pronouncement, then it's as if the exception didn't happen. You default to the original number. So if a man says to his wife, you are divorced 3 except 3, she's divorced unfortunately 3 times, and it's it's final. Now, I'm not necessarily going to do all of the examples, but you're divorced 3 except 2 except 1. Well, the except 1 is taken from the 2, so it's 3 except 1, so 3 minus 1 is 2, so she's divorced twice. So believe it or not, this is not very abstract, because in the Arab world, at least what I'm familiar with, unfortunately people of a certain class, of a certain cultural understanding, they do that. When I was at Dar al-Ifta on a daily basis in Egypt, believe it or not, I actually saw this, which I was surprised. I thought this was only stuff that the books of fiqh wrote about. I didn't know that people actually talk like that. I remember I was in a bookstore once. Sorry, this is just a tangent. I was in a bookstore once, and a man was trying to haggle over a book. And he said, alayya talaq, make divorce for me mandatory if you don't sell it to me for like, 50 pounds or something like that. He was trying to haggle the price. And I was like almost offended. I was like, why would you say that? That's such, you're opening yourself to divorcing your wife over the price of a book. But unfortunately, in Muslim majority cultures, you will find this. So it is important that you know, even if you, like me, it's not, I don't talk like that, alhamdulillah, so it's not a part of my culture, but it's one of those things where I studied something theoretically, and then when I started interacting with Muslim majority people, I saw that it happened, so I had to be able to kind of like wed the two. So it does happen. So the exception of the divorce can happen, but number one is that the exception can't cover the number of divorce, and number two, the pronouncement of the exception has to be connected. What that means is, if I'm going to say, if a man says to his wife, you are divorced 3 times except 1, there's a break there. Now, is that break because I was catching my breath, or I was having a sip of water, or the phone rang and I was looking at my phone? If it's customarily an accepted break, then we link the exception to the pronouncement. But if it's broken, like if a man says he wakes up at Salatul Fajr and, I don't know, his wife left something on the floor, I'm just making it up, and he stubbed his toe and he got so mad and he said, you are divorced. And then after he prays Salatul Fajr and he does the khatam of the Salah and the sun comes up and he prays Duha, and then he says, except once, khalas, that exception doesn't count because too much time has passed. Remember, we talked about almost the same thing when we talked about the prayer. So when you combine your prayers, if you're traveling or if you're sick or whatnot, you can combine the prayers as long as the gap between, let's say you want to bring Asr up to Dhuhr, Jama' Taqdeem, you can do that as long as when you say Salam, Salam from Dhuhr prayer, not too much time has passed, that is customarily too much time, and you stand and pray Asr. But if I prayed Dhuhr, if I'm traveling, and I'm praying Dhuhr, I prayed 2 rakahs, Salam, Salam, and I got up, let's go get something to eat. I was like, oh, we should have prayed Asr, let's come back, Allahu Akbar, and pray Asr. You can't, because you've broken the time. So the gap of time in the pronouncement is the same fiqh, it's the same philosophy of fiqh as we discovered elsewhere. Also, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, when you, the hadith of Dhul Yadayn that we read in the hadith, the fiqh of hadith class, in the book of Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah radiallahu anhu, that when the Prophet ﷺ prayed the 2 rakahs, prayed the 2 rakahs for Dhuhr or Asr, and Dhul Yadayn said, did the prayer, Aqasat al-Salah, and Nasit ya Rasulullah, has the prayer been shortened or did you forget? And the Prophet ﷺ said, Kullu dhalika lam yakun, that whole exchange, we said that the Prophet ﷺ stood up right away and prayed 2 rakahs because he did not speak enough words to sever, to move out of the mode of prayer to the mode of something else. So this concept that we've just mentioned is something that is you'll find it's injected to not all, I don't want to over-exaggerate, many sections of fiqh. So now that we're getting towards the end of the fiqh discussion, I want you to also keep in mind that there are just fiqh principles, what we call qawa'id al-fiqhiyya. This is how we develop them. So, it is valid to make an exception. So that's the first rule, that a man can divorce his wife with an exception, illa, except. Of course, it can take place in any language. When pronouncing a divorce pronouncement, as long as it is connected to the pronouncement, meaning not too much time has passed, and the exception has not overcome the majority of the original pronouncement. Right? That's not in the text, but that's in the commentary. Allah. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? Okay, another condition is the man has to have an intention. Okay, and this is where one of the biggest areas of the difference between the theory of fiqh and the application of fiqh is in the intention. So if somebody, and I get calls like this all the time, or messages, my wife divorced me, my husband divorced me, or I divorced my wife, but what is the ruling? I said, look, I don't know. I have to talk to you, because textbook, if I took it at face value, it's all divorced. But then when you sit and you interview them, you find out, well, the man didn't intend it, or he was upset, or something like that. So when it comes to divorce specifically, you never give an answer based on theory unless it's in like a classroom setting like this, in which we are talking about the theory of it, or we're creating a scenario to emphasize and to buttress our understanding of the fiqh. In real life, you can't do that. In real life, you have to bring the people, and you have to sit with them or interview them or establish a Zoom call. You got to see them, and you got to ask them the question. So the intention is important. And one condition also is that the man has to at least hear himself. So we can't just have something like, well, in my heart, I was upset at you, honey, and I could divorce you this morning. That doesn't count. You have to say it. He has to at least audibly say it to himself the way the same level of audio-ness, if that's a word, like when you pray Dhuhr and Asr by yourself. You don't just stand there, Allahu Akbar, and just read the Fatiha in your mind. You have to sound out the Fatiha so at least you can hear it. So same concept of fiqh, same principle. It has to be auditory. Now there can be disputes if he says it and then the wife testifies that he didn't say that. We take her testimony. But if he says it and she wasn't present, then we take his testimony. And there can be abuse, of course, in which a man, according to what I just said, theoretically can divorce his wife without his wife knowing about it. Now, this is also a big difference between the theory of fiqh and the application of fiqh, because in the modern world, especially in Muslim majority countries, we don't allow those types of divorces, because then everyone would be divorced. And divorce is one of those major problems in society, any society, not just Islamic societies. So again, I just, maybe in the first couple of videos, I'm going to emphasize this importance, the difference between the theory and the practice, because if you took this, it can become very draconian if you did not understand that there's a context. All we're doing now is discussing the theory of the fiqh according to the ijtihad of Imam Shafi'i radiyallahu anhu. Okay. Another thing, another qa'dah that comes is talqa la tataba'ad. So you can't say divorce cannot be divided, or partitioned. So I can't say I divorce you twice except half. That doesn't count. Then you're divorced twice. So you can't. If some of the divorce exists, then all of it exists. That's a qa'dah of fiqh. That's a fiqh principle. So divorce has to be a whole number, 1, 2, or 3. You can't make an exception that's sort of a fraction of it. That doesn't work. And it's as if saying, I divorce you 3 except 3. It doesn't count. Okay, we'll pick up the rest of this discussion in the next and final clip, inshallah. All right, the next line for us to consider is it is valid to make divorce contingent upon the occurrence of an attribute or a condition. So a sifa and a ma'na. A sifa is a attribute. So the sifa is a meaning. The condition is a statement. So a man says to his wife, I will divorce you the first of Ramadan. So the minute we pray Maghrib, and tomorrow is the first day of fasting, the minute Allahu Akbar of Maghrib comes in, then she's divorced. Because the meaning is that when the first of Ramadan comes. Well, that's the first of Ramadan. The beginning of the first of Ramadan is the Maghrib of the night before. The first night we pray Taraweeh. He gives all these ridiculous examples. When the sun comes up tomorrow, you're divorced. So when the sun comes up, you're divorced. Now, back and forth in my mind. You can't make a condition something impossible. So you can't say, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes two opposites to unite, then you are divorced. Well, that doesn't count because it's impossible. So it's mustahil aqlan. It's impossible that, it's impossible that this be a phone and a bird at the same time. Right? Or that this can be, I guess this is light blue, that this can be blue and yellow at the same time. Right? It's a better example. Naqidain, it's either this or that. So those type of things don't count. Or, if Allah doesn't, forgive sins, then you are divorced. Something ridiculous. He actually gives these kind of examples. Al-Bajuri and other muhashun. That's impossible. Allah Ghafurun Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, all of that's impossible, right? Allah Ta'ala is most forgiving. كل ابن آدم خطاء وخير الخطائين التوابون. Every person sins. The best of sinners are those that always turn to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Why? Because Allah Ta'ala forgives. So anyway, those type of conditions, those type of descriptions don't count. Now the conditions, the shart I said is it has to be spoken. So a common example is if you leave the house, then you are divorced. So the idea is if she left the house, she's divorced. Now, when it comes to that, there are some rules to the conditions. One of the rules is that the default understanding of the conditions is that it's not something that's repetitive. So it's only one occurrence. Another default rule is that it's understood to happen now. So if you leave the house, you are divorced, the mufti or the qadi would understand that as now, like within the next hour. But like if tomorrow you leave the house, then it's not something that's overlasting. So this is an area where theory and the practice kind of help. You need to know that because there are people that do that. So commenting, I'll give you a real example, is a man will tell, I don't want you going to your parents' house, and if you go to your parents' house, then you're divorced or something like that. So that doesn't mean all the time, and that doesn't mean every time. The default would, unless there are more conditions, which I hope there are not, the default will be like right now, today, immediately. So there are some conditions to the conditions and how we understand. This is general. Of course, a man can be super specific. I don't want you going to your fulan's house, so-and-so's house ever again, no matter what. Okay, that's a pretty difficult statement. And of course, the intention is an important thing. Now, the difference between the condition, the difference between the attribute and the condition, as I said, is the attribute is a description, and the condition has to be spoken. And when the description is spoken, the fatwa part of the fiqh, the application part of the fiqh, goes really into the details of what exactly was the specific words that the man spoke to establish this condition, and did in fact the lady violate the condition or not. So that's something that you also find in theory and in practice. So in the Hawashi literature, alhamdulillah, we talk about that a lot. And I said, like, the condition of something that's impossible doesn't count. Okay. So let me give you an example that he gives. If a man said to his wife, if you speak to Zayd, you are divorced, and then she spoke to the wall, but Zayd heard it. So that doesn't count. That is not a violation of the condition. She's not divorced. So it's very literal and very specific. It's not like the fatwa side of it says, well, that's not really what he meant. No, we take it very, very specifically and literally, which is a very big difference than Western legal systems, unfortunately. Unfortunate for Western legal systems. For us, alhamdulillah, I always say this, Sharia, fiqh is a very precise instrument. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Okay, and then the last line for us to consider is pronouncing divorce prior to marriage does not take place. So if you're not married, the divorce is only a function of marriage. If the man hasn't, so I can't go to a woman who I haven't married and said, if I marry you, then you're divorced. That's nonsense. It doesn't count for anything. It has to be a divorce. It has to be a marriage that's duly constituted, and then the divorce is a derivative possibility of that marriage. So it's not like it's just willy-nilly. You can just go around divorcing whomever you would like. So a man can't go to a woman and say, you are divorced, and he's not married to her, and then he marries her, and then is she automatically divorced? No. Nor can he say and make a condition, if I marry you, you are divorced. Again, well, he's not married to her, so it doesn't count. So those type of statements don't have any weight in the Sharia. Why would somebody do that? That's another issue altogether. So the condition and the attribute, type of divorce, both of those do not count for the person that is not married, for a woman who is not your wife. Okay, that took a lot less time than I thought. Let me go back for a little bit to look at something. I think there was something in the conditions I wanted to mention to you. Oh, yeah. If a man issues a divorce pronouncement to his wife based on an attribute or a condition, let's say, and then the woman forgot and did it, then she's also not divorced. So if you go to the fruit market today, you are divorced. This happened early in the morning, and the tempers were flaring and raging, and people were angry, so on and so forth. And then Asr Maghrib comes, and the woman decides to go get fruits for the kids. Totally forgot that happened in the morning. That also doesn't count. So there is a lot of flexibility in how the Sharia deals with the divorce pronouncement that is connected to an attribute or a condition. I mean, the attribute's a little bit different, so when the attribute exists, then the divorce exists. Here, it's more so with the issue of a condition. So when you find a condition, there are going to be flexibilities such that it's meant to be done right away. It's not meant to be ongoing. If the person forgets, if you find a loophole, like I spoke to the wall, I didn't speak to the person, so things like that, that works to get out of the divorce. Now, when I said the condition is not, the default understanding of a condition divorce is not that it's ongoing, except if you say anytime, like, and the word that he uses there is kullama, every single time. So I don't want you to go there anymore ever again, no matter what. I mean, that's definitive. But I don't want you to go to Zainab's house and visit her anymore. Then the default understanding would be now and once, not forever and ongoing. One interesting thing that he says is if a man tells his wife, I will divorce you 3 times if you go to your father's house. Upon me are 3 divorces if you go to your father's house, so that you are divorced. Shihab al-Ramli said that this counts as 3 following the attribute, and then the son, Shams al-Ramli, says that it counts as 1, taking the last part of the statement. And both of these opinions are considered the mu'tamad. It's one of those weird things in the madhab. So there is, again, differences of opinions within the madhab of how we interpret these statements, but they are usually taken extremely literally and with intention. We'll put a pin in here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, we concluded our first lecture in this new module, Fiqh of Marriage and Divorce 2, and we picked up the beginning discussions of the number of divorces. So we talked about that a free man has 3 divorces, a slave has 2 divorces. We talked about some of the details of that, and then we also talked about, I don't have the book so I don't make it up. We talked about the permissibility of making an exception when having a divorce pronouncement, as long as the exception does not cover the original pronouncement and there's not a gap in the statement. A gap that is considered customarily too long would not make the exception count. But if you stopped, like I just did, to swallow or to take a breath, have a sip of water, if the phone rang, you looked at the phone, if somebody knocked at the door, you looked at the door, and then you continued what you were saying, those would count. We also talked about the validity of making a divorce contingent upon the occurrence of an attribute and a condition. We said the attribute is something that's in meaning, so when that meaning is manifest, then that's when the divorce happens. The condition is something that must be spoken, and we talked about there's quite a bit of details actually when it comes to the conditions. So the condition is meant, the default understanding is the condition is meant that it happens now. It is not meant that it's ongoing. And if a woman, for example, forgot that condition was thrust upon her associated with a divorce, and then she did it, she's not divorced. And we gave several examples of that kind of thinking with divorces based on conditions. And then lastly, we talked about the pronouncement of the divorce prior to marriage does not take effect. Whether it's a general pronouncement of divorce or a divorce based on conditions, both types do not count if there is no marriage to start out with. So because divorce can only be a function of marriage. That being said, one of the other main things I wanted you to get from today's lecture that I kind of tried to stress is that not only in today's lecture, but all of these type of lectures, I want you to keep in mind that there's always going to be a difference between theory and the practice of law. We are studying the theory of law as understood in the madhab of Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu. But when we come to apply this in real life situations, there are all sorts of different mitigating circumstances, including taking weak positions, other madhab, etc., in order to keep people married rather than sever relationships. So while you are studying the theory, keep in mind that there's another half of this, which is the necessity to learn the practice of the law, which inshallah we'll get to at another time. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.